Hello, welcome tonight to the GLHS March 9th quarterly Zoom meeting. Tonight, we have 3 entertaining and informative mini presentations. We're going to do them in alphabetical order by speaker. Our first presentation tonight is Norman Jacobs on pandemic tennis. Current vice president of Sports Philatelist International, has written many philatelic articles, created exhibits, including Tennis from Game of Kings to King of Games. Norman?
Thank you very much, Lisa. It's a pleasure to be here with you. And actually, GLHS and SPI, Sports Philatelist International, have established a bit of a connection over the last couple of years. I had an article that appeared in the GLHS journal in the beginning of this past year on Sally Ride. And Lori had an article in the SPI Journal of Sports Philately, on Helen Hull Jacobs, a tennis player. So we really are excited about the connection and we want to keep it going. So the rest of you who have interest in sports, keep that in mind. That's really the end of the editorial commentary, and I'm going to see if we will be able to share the screen the way I would like to do it. Let me get it up here. All right, can somebody confirm that we're sharing? Is the screen sharing?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay, good.
Yes.
Just wanted to be sure. My interest in tennis philatelically has been in place for a very long time. And I have collected aid stamps, so I guess I had a little pandemic connection, but it really wasn't until COVID came along that I got highly interested in trying to collect the pandemic. It was an amazing opportunity for a totally new collecting area and a way to make a horrible situation look halfway good. So that's why the pandemic tennis thought arose. And what I'd like to focus on is what happened in the year 2020 related to tennis during this pandemic, because there were really some surprising and unusual events that took place. It actually started relatively normally. The Australian Open, which was in January, occurred at a time when there had been a few cases in China, but as you heard in the earlier discussion, nothing at that point in the United States that we were aware of or any other countries. And the tennis at the Australian Open in Rod Laver Arena, which you see on this first postmarked cover, was attended by thousands of fans, a packed arena, a typical tournament. And as he has done many times in the past, Novak Djokovic won the tournament, and everything looked pretty normal. But if you look at the postmark, this is not a tennis postmark. This is Stay Safe and Connected Australia, because the actual cover was mailed in July. And by then, COVID was much more on the minds of Australians than tennis. In the spring, the Davis Cup matches occurred in the beginning of March. And then both the men's and women's tours decided to take a hiatus because they weren't sure how bad COVID was going to get. So they decided to take 6 weeks off. That was in March. On April Fool's Day, the All England Lawn Tennis Club announced that Wimbledon in July was going to be canceled. That announcement was greeted with a little bit of skepticism because it was April Fool's Day, and a fair amount of concern because this was one of the major tournaments and it was canceling months in advance. There's a backstory to this, however, and I've tried to indicate it by using this particular postmark that says, "Are you underinsured?" The other 3 Grand Slam or major tournaments were not just underinsured, they were uninsured. But after the SARS epidemic in 2002 to 2003, the organizers of Wimbledon decided it would be a good idea to have something called pandemic insurance. And they paid 1.5 million pounds a year for 20 years to have coverage in case they had to cancel the tournament because of a pandemic. So forward to April the 1st, 2020, no coverage if you try to have the tournament, no coverage if you have it and you can't have spectators, but 174 million pounds sterling coming back to you if you cancel your tournament. So I think for them it was an unfortunate, a stressful, but a fairly simple business decision to cancel. During the rest of the spring, the tennis world had very little to do. This stamp from the Republic of Niger shows a tennis racket, some tennis balls, and a coronavirus. And I suspect that the virus particle was probably looking about that big to the athletes at that point in time because they had nothing to do. They had no tournaments that they could play. A number of postal administrations produced postmarks to try to support the efforts in COVID-19. This one from Shanghai shows a raised fist to fight coronavirus, and several sports, including in the upper right corner, a tennis player. Monaco has a tournament every spring in April. It's a very well attended tournament. You can see on the stamp the rather large stadium and huge crowds, and they issue a stamp for it every single year. They issued this stamp at the end of March, but it just so happened that the tournament had already been canceled 2 weeks before the stamp was issued. So that was a little bit of a letdown for not only the Postal Service, but the people of Monaco. A bigger concern was that the Olympics, which was scheduled for July of 2020, had to be postponed, and that decision was made by the IOC and the Japanese government in early April. Here we have a recognition philatelically of that difficulty. We have an athlete throwing a discus that now has turned into a coronavirus. And as most discus throwers would do, this athlete wants to throw the coronavirus as far away from him as he possibly can. Unfortunately, the harmony of tradition and modernity that was supposed to be occurring in July of 2020 with the Tokyo Olympics and the opportunity to display all of the features that we have come to love about the Olympics just wasn't going to be there that year. Monaco tried again in the fall to get a stamp out for the Olympics, and it says Tokyo 2020, so you might think that was a bit of a mistake too. But in the small print, you'll see that they list the dates of the rescheduled Olympics, 23rd of July to 8th of August of 2021. And Monaco has athletes in 8 sports who've qualified for the 2020 Games, which is still its official title. And that includes tennis, as you can see here at the lower right with the tennis player serving. Monaco will hope to participate in 8 different sports, but maybe not. The Japanese people have reacted to the coronavirus with a great deal of concern, as have other people around the world, but they've tried to be philosophical at the same time. This frame stamp, which is a stamp that is created by a private group, in this case, the Japan Philatelic Society Foundation, and then produced by Japan Post, shows something that probably none of you have ever seen before. It's called an amoeba. The amoeba is a chimeric female creature that was said to have arisen from the sea. It was first described in 1846 in some newspaper articles, and it has features of birds, fish, and humans. And it was a creature with what was thought to be some magical powers. And in 1846, the creature came, was here, and then disappeared again, but left behind instructions that were printed in the newspaper to the effect of, quote, "If an epidemic ever spreads, draw a picture of me and show it to everyone," unquote. The idea being that that would protect against the epidemic. Well, in March of 2020, the University of Kyoto, someone there rediscovered the Amebee, published this again online, and all of a sudden it took off. People started using Amebee creatures on their masks. The Ministry of Health used it in their campaign to tell young people about the dangers of COVID, and it ended up on the stamps. So maybe Amebee will be able to disperse the pandemic and allow the Olympics to take place. However, something happened today, which you may or may not have already heard about. The Japanese government earlier today announced that they have decided that no foreign spectators will be allowed into Japan for the 2020 Olympics that is hopefully going to take place in July of 2021. So those of us philatelists, and I have several friends who fall into this group who would have gone to the Olympics as both sports enthusiasts and philatelists, will be out of luck this year. Now, after we got through the summer, some other philatelic agencies decided to try to help educate the public about coronavirus. And these are a couple. The one on the left, I have to admit, doesn't have a whole lot to do with sports unless you like to chase elephants. It was produced by the Austrian Post that has a history of kind of having a good sense of humor. And what they have done with this is to show the 1 meter distance that was initially the European distance for separation. We all know that now we're trying for about 2 meters. But they showed it on a semi-postal. You can see the 275 plus 275 over here. Here's the stamp with perforations. Here's the whole miniature sheet, if you will, or souvenir sheet. And it's printed on toilet paper. Austrian Post figured out a way to attach a glued surface to the back of toilet paper. You could literally peel the stamp off and use it. I doubt very many people peeled it off and used it. It was a educational and fundraising technique. Later in the fall, Bosnia-Herzegovina issued a souvenir sheet that really was scheduled for the summer of 2020, but they canceled it after coronavirus hit because they weren't sure what was going to happen to sports. And then later decided to reprint it before its release. And they added the 2 meter separations in between these athletes, and they added the wording at the top about sport COVID-19. And that required a second pass through the printing machine. So if you look very carefully, you may someday be able to find inverts, misprints, and other strange types of souvenir sheet, since they did have to put it through the machine a second time. Well, we talked about the Australian Open and Wimbledon. What about the other majors? The US Open actually occurred on time. Unfortunately, spectators were not permitted. It produced a very strange image on TV because the stands were there, the cameras were on the stands, and all of the fancy sponsor boxes were actually occupied by other tennis players who weren't playing that particular match. So you got to see the tennis players sitting there eating their lunch in front of the sponsor box, watching the matches. It was a very strange, semi-empty stadium. The two best players on the men's tour are Nadal and Djokovic. They would have been ranked 1 and 2. But what happened? Well, Nadal decided to stay in Mallorca rather than going across the ocean to go to the hard court season. He decided to wait for the postponed French Open and not do the US Open. Djokovic had a very strange summer. He organized a charity tour in Serbia, which unfortunately didn't use social distancing. Djokovic and several other players came down with COVID-19. They had to cancel the end of that tournament, and he got a lot of bad publicity over it. Then he fought with the USTA about how many people he could bring with him to New York during the Open, and there were very strict rules about that, which he had to obey. Just wasn't in a very good mood. And in his 4th round match, he slammed the ball in anger, surprisingly was not penalized by the umpire, but several games later, he had a ball in his hand and he just hit it because he was upset about something. And the ball traveled on the fly, slammed right into the throat of one of the lineswomen, knocking her over. She had to be taken from the court. She couldn't continue. And by the rules, the umpire had absolutely no choice. At that point, Djokovic was defaulted from the match and eliminated from the tournament, a tournament that he likely would have won. He was doing very well up until that point. As just a parenthetical thing, this souvenir sheet has a major mistake on it. It's not a printing error, it's a design error. Nadal looks fine, but if you look over here at Djokovic, he's hitting a really nice slice backhand with his left hand. There's only one problem with that. Djokovic is right-handed. The stamp designer got an image of Djokovic, flipped it, or it was flipped before he ever saw it, didn't realize it, and the stamp on the souvenir sheet came out with that flipped image. The French Open should have occurred in May. Instead, it occurred in October. It more or less worked. They had about 1,000 spectators per day. Unfortunately, the centenary of the Fédération Française de Tennis was that year, and so a lot of the celebration that they would have occurred simply couldn't take place. But the tournament did manage to come off as scheduled in October, and Rafael Nadal also managed to win it, beating a very well-behaved Djokovic in the final. Nadal beat him in straight sets for his 13th French Open victory. That's a record that probably will not be broken, at least when any of us are alive. It's an incredible record for any tennis tournament, but particularly for a tournament as grueling as the French Open. So that takes us through the year. It's a very strange year. Lots of funny things happened. And then we get to the Australian Open in 2021. Should have occurred in January. They postponed it a month. It did occur in February. And to nobody's real surprise, just as he had done in January of 2020, Novak Djokovic won that tournament as well. I thought I would end with a view of the spectators at the Australian Open. This actually, of course, given that there's only one person wearing a mask here, was created by my son-in-law using a somewhat older photograph, but I couldn't resist ending with that particular note. And I'll be happy to take any questions. I'm going to stop sharing the screen, but I'm sure you'd rather see Bernie than me anyway.
Oh, thank you very much. I enjoyed your Bernie picture immensely. That was perfect for the end of the year.
Excellent.
Thank you.
When was the Niger stamp issued? Because that's very cool.
Yeah, it is. It is a cool stamp. It was issued roughly June or July of 2020. I could get you an exact date. There's another stamp also from another country, another African country, that deals with the cessation of the tour in a different way, but I thought this one was more interesting artistically. I've got a little issue with the huge numbers of stamps that have come out for some of those countries through the agencies. So if I were exhibiting, I honestly wouldn't include that stamp, but it's such a cool image that for purposes of just talking about it, I did include it.
That's the trouble with some of those wallpaper countries, is that they include images that no other countries will have.
That's true. When I'm doing my tennis exhibit, for example, I've got an 8-frame tennis philately exhibit, which is not a display, so I have to use all the traditional thematic guidelines. There are tons of things that I simply have to exclude. So you learn how to work around something that one of those countries shows, but you can get the same point across in some other ways. You just have to be a little creative to figure out how to do it.
Is someone interesting in that pandemic tennis we play tennis, but we're not any good, okay? But we enjoy playing tennis. And during the pandemic, we're like, that is a socially distanced activity that we could do. We could go outside, play tennis in the summer, but our parks departments put padlocks on all the tennis courts and closed them all during the pandemic. So we're like,
Yeah, it's the knowledge about COVID-19 is growing over time. And in the beginning, there was a tremendous concern about contacts and surfaces and things like that. And it became apparent over time that although that's not an impossible way for transmission to occur, that it's very much a respiratory disease, and that's where the major attention should be. Where I live, there are a lot of people who play tennis, and it's actually continued throughout the whole time, albeit they had some concerns about people handling the tennis balls in the beginning, and they had to kind of work through that.
wear gloves.
I think it was kind of like, wash your hands before you stick them in your mouth.
Norman, I loved learning about Amabi in the Japanese stamps.
Yeah, the Amabi is an amazing image, and I have to thank my friend Jean Wang for that from Toronto. She alerted me to the Amabi. I've actually got an article that will be in the next issue of the Journal of Sports Philately on pandemic tennis with the Amabi in there. So I really appreciate Jean having discovered that.
And we got to hear it first here right, before
That's right.
reading it.
Pre-publication.
Well, thank you very much for your presentation and taking the time. We appreciate it immensely.
Oh,
Any
thank
other
you.
questions?
It was fun.
May I add something?
Mhm.
Yeah, I'm Maxim from the Netherlands. Actually, it's already tomorrow. It's just gone 2 o'clock in the morning. Well, I like the presentation. I don't know much about tennis, but I've got a few COVID stamps myself. And what was rather nice to see is that Monaco also issued a stamp for the Dubai Expo, which is also cancelled. So they got 2 in a row. And Switzerland actually managed to issue stamps for 2 sporting events that were cancelled. First, the World Championships ice hockey, and later on the road cycling World Championships. So they missed out 2. And I got another one, a nice one about the distance. You see in Austria it is 1 meter, and in Bosnia it's 2 meters. In the Netherlands it's 1.5 meters. We have a word in Dutch. It's one word, the 1.5 meter society, which we'll probably end up with after the epidemic. But there's a very nice stamp from French Polynesia with 2 Polynesian women, beautiful dresses, matching face masks, and between them 6 coconuts, which is the distance you have to keep in French Polynesia.
Actually, I like the 6 coconuts best of all. Thank you.
There's
That was a great presentation, Norman. Really appreciate it. Can you tell me if tennis was ever a Olympic sport throughout the ages? Was tennis ever?
Yeah, the short answer is yes. The slightly longer answer is that it was in the Olympics from the beginning, 1896, albeit only men originally, then women several years later. It continued as a full Olympic sport until 1924. There was then a big dispute between the IOC and the International Tennis Federation about what the definition was of an amateur, and tennis disappeared from the Olympics. It came back as a demonstration sport in 1968, Mexico City, disappeared again, demonstration sport in 1984 in Los Angeles, and then starting in 1988, full-fledged medal sport from then until now.
Good. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Our next presentation, Sports Meets Philately, by Mark Maestrone. He's the current president of Sports Philately International, the editor of the Journal of Sports Philately, webmaster of sportstamps.org. He's also an active philatelic and literature exhibitor at both national and international levels, having won numerous gold medals as well as 2 U.S. National Grand Awards. Mark?
Nice to be here with you all today. Thank you very much for inviting me. And I'm not going to give you a sales pitch because Norm already did that. So I'm free from doing that. So if you don't mind, I'm just going to jump right into the presentation. Let me see if I can share my screen here. There we go. We get it back up to the beginning. Okay. And let's see, I can actually, I think, oh, there we go. So I've often been intrigued by the intersection of sport and art and philately. Now, typically, most times when we see sports or Olympic photographs or stamps, they come from previous works of art. So for example, Myron's Discobolus is a great example. It's been depicted on countless stamps over the years. Depicts a classical period athlete from 2,500 years ago. And then jumping into the future, nowadays we see a lot of athletes on stamps having won a medal at an Olympic Games. So what we see here is Demosthenes Tampakos, who is a Greek gymnast, and in 2004 he won a gold medal at those games. This was actually a stamp from a photograph of him holding up his medal right after the award ceremony. This became a very popular way of showing athletes, Olympic medalists on stamps, and it began at the 2000 games in Australia. It was actually the Philatelic Service of Australia that came up with this great idea of let's take a photograph and within 24 hours we've got a stamp. So it was, and that actually has been something that's been continued as a tradition now since 2000. So you will often see, well, I would have expected it to happen in Tokyo. But anyway, so these are basically the two kinds of sportsmen on stamps that we traditionally see, either a sculpture or something of that nature, or it's an actual photograph. But my challenge was I wanted to find a sports figure that was actually portrayed in artwork that was other than a photograph, who was reproduced on a stamp. So thinking about Tokyo, I'm thinking, well, let's take a look back at 1964, which was the first games that Tokyo had, first Olympic Games that Tokyo had. And I took a look at the USSR men's Olympic gymnastics team from that year. The Soviet team was just kind of becoming a dominant group in men's gymnastics at the time. Excuse me. And three notable members from that particular team I've shown here: Yuri Titov, Sergei Diamidov, and Boris Shokhlin. So Yuri Titov had already been in the Olympics for a while. He had racked up 9 Olympic medals during his career, but his greatest impact on the sport of gymnastics was that once he retired from active gymnastics, he actually became the leader of the International Gymnastics Federation, and he held that title as president for 20 years. So he was quite an impactful person on the sport. Then Sergei Diamidov, upper right there, he was not as prolific a medal winner as his teammates, but one thing that he did have was he had a movement on the parallel bars that were actually named after him. And it's a swinging and twisting movement that actually continues to be used today on most elite level and Olympic level gymnastics performances on parallel bars. Then at lower right here, we have Boris Shokhlin. Now, Boris was probably the best known of all the men on the Olympic team that year. During his career, he won 13 Olympic medals, 7 of them gold. So In 1965, a Soviet artist named Dmitry Zelinsky, who was well known in the Soviet Union, was commissioned to do a portrait of the Olympic team from 1964. And you can see here, even the women's team is exercising in the back. Now, what's important here is this is not a photograph of the gymnast. This is actually a piece of artwork that portrays the competitors. This was done by Zelinsky in, it's interesting, the literature that I read on it says that it actually was done in 1964 to 1965. I don't know why it took that long a span of time, but so I can't tell whether this was done pre-Tokyo or after Tokyo. So not that it really makes too much of a difference. But in this particular case, I've just pointed out those particular three gymnasts and who they are or how they're represented in the painting. So we have at upper right here, we have Sergei Diamidov, who is shown on his favorite piece of equipment, the parallel bars. And what he's doing here is he's actually measuring the distance between the parallel bars with the distance from his elbow to his fingertips. That gives him the proper distance between the bars for his swinging movements. Then down in the lower right-hand corner, we have Boris Shocklin. And Boris was known as the man of iron because of his steely physique and his resolve. Here he's shown by the artist striking a very casual pose with hand on hip. Then the last one, Yuri Titov had a tough time at the 1964 Olympics. And this is why I kind of posed the question of, was this piece of artwork done before or after the Tokyo Games? I'm going to take the position that it was done after the Games. Titov had a tough time. 2 weeks before the 64 Olympics in Tokyo, he badly injured his arm. He competed in pain for most of those Olympic Games. And in fact, in the floor exercise, he landed on his face. So I'd like to think that maybe the artist who painted the picture looked at him and thought, maybe he's looking wistfully into the distance, wondering what might have been if he hadn't been injured. And finally, from artwork, we go to stamp. In 2011, Russia actually took that piece of artwork and issued a stamp for it. And this was actually a series of famous works of art, but this was the only sports-oriented one in that series. And so, in essence, we've come full circle. Sport meets art meets philately, and my challenge was completed. That's it. Thank you very much.
That was good.
Let me get back up here and running again here. Okay, I've lost everybody now. Let's see. How do I get everybody back up and running?
We're here. If you stop sharing, then you'll see
did
us.
I not stop sharing? Oh, here we go. That's
There
what I
you
had.
go.
What I hadn't stopped sharing. Thank you.
Yep, then we're
There we
behind
go.
there.
Perfect. Thank you.
Well, thank you. That was fun. It's fun to set a challenge up for yourself and try and think outside the box and
Good.
find
Thank you.
things. I would not be able to do either of those presentations because I cannot pronounce any of those people's names. Does anybody have any questions for Mark?
Lisa, that's where you need the voice simulator.
There you go.
Enjoyed the presentation, Mark.
Oh, thank you very much, Dale.
Yes,
And of
thank
course,
you,
we
Mark.
invite all of you or any of you who would like to join Sports Philately International to come on by anytime. That's my sales pitch. That's the only pitch I'll give you.
Well, we
That was great.
appreciate
Thank you.
you coming. We all four, the next speaker, attended the HEA's first presentation class virtually on creating PowerPoints. And then although we already all knew how to do PowerPoints, but I got to see different people give different PowerPoints. And I felt that people would both enjoy both Norman's and Mark's. Mark's had lots of pictures of very nice looking men, so, you know. Okay. Our next speaker is presentation is on LGBTQ authors of children's literature, and it's by our very own John Stefanak. He is the GLHS member, vice president, columnist of all the LGBT new issues, and a regular contributor of articles to the GLHS e-journal. So thank you, John.
Thank you, Lisa. I'm starting to share. Let me know when you can see.
I can see.
Very good. So when I was researching gay and lesbian history on the stamps, I came across several stamps, several authors, and I was very surprised to find so many of them. Of these authors also wrote specifically for children, so I thought I'd put something together. Hans Christian Andersen was born in Odense, Denmark, in a relatively poor family. So at age 14, he went to Copenhagen to find employment as an actor. He had an excellent soprano voice and got a position with the Royal Danish Theatre, but then his voice changed. So he decided to focus on writing. And he wrote his first story at the age of 17. It's called The Ghost at Palnatoke's Grave. He continued to write for various magazines and whatnot, but then he got a travel grant from the king and traveled to Italy, and he turned that travel experience into a novel that he published in 1835. And this is the first recognition he got in his home country. And in that same year, he published the first of his fairy tales. And about 10 years later, they got translated for the first time into foreign languages, and that's when he finally got international recognition. And some of his most famous short stories and fairy tales are The Princess and the Pea, Thumbelina, The Little Mermaid, The Emperor's New Clothes, The Ugly Duckling, and The Little Match Girl. In the end, he wrote 168 fairy tales. Someone else who wrote fairy tales was Oscar Wilde. He was born in Dublin, Ireland, and he was in school. He impressed his peers with humorous, inventive stories. And he basically was a writer for most of his life. He published his first book of poems in 1881 at the age of 27. He wrote plays like The Importance of Being Earnest and Salome and Lady Windermere's Fan. But for children, he wrote two books of fairy tales. One was called The Happy Prince and Other Tales, and the second one was called A House of Pomegranates. Sir James Matthew Barrie was born in Kirriemuir, Angus, Scotland, north of Dundee. And he was a small child he was small as a child, I should say, who drew attention to himself with storytelling. Let's see, he published his first novels in 1888, and he turned to theater, where he wrote plays, including Peter Pan. It first started out as a play. In fact, the character Peter Pan first appeared in a novel that he wrote called The Little White Bird, but he turned it into a play, and is basically what he's most known for now. He also changed rewrote the play into a novel called Peter and Wendy. Gabriela Mistral was born in Vicuña, Chile, and she supported herself at the age of 15 by working as a teacher's aide. She went on to complete her teacher's certificate and become teaching at local schools, and also writing poetry at the same time. She got her first poems published in the local newspaper in 1904, and then went on to write publish several books of poetry. They always included works for children, such as rounds and lullabies. And in 1945, she was awarded the Nobel Prize in Literature. Gloria Fuertes was born in Madrid, Spain, and at the age of 5, she started writing and illustrating stories. She published her first poem at age 14 and started to work as an accountant and secretary. But during the 1940s and into 1950s, she started working at children's magazines in Spain. She became very popular among young readers, writing little stories, little poetries, and small plays, and that sort of thing. She went on in the 1970s to become involved with television programs and in the end, she wrote about 18 books of poetry for children, 4 plays, and was involved in 5 television programs. Maria Elena Walsh was born in Ramos Mejia, just west of Buenos Aires in Argentina. She published her first poems at age 15. She became very popular in Argentina. She went to Paris with a friend, Leda Valladares, and sang Argentine folk songs in cafes in Paris for a while, but then returned to Argentina, where she decided to write for children. She was very prolific. She wrote like 21 books for children. She wrote songs and lyrics and poems and plays, and she also got involved in doing television programs for Argentina television. These stamps show some of the little stamp on the left shows this a stamp, her song called Canción del Correo, which is translates as the mail song. And on the right are some stamps that show illustrations of some of the characters from her stories and plays. Enid Blyton was born in South London, and she excelled in writing while she was at school. She published her first poems in 1916 in Nash's magazine. She also trained as a teacher, but she also worked as a governess, and she won a competition with an essay in 1920. Her first book of a collection of poems was published in 1924. She also went on to publish some educational texts in the 20s and 30s that were quite influential. But starting in the 1930s and into the 40s, she wrote dozens and dozens of books for children. In fact, her books became enormously popular. They were translated into 90 languages, and her books are among the world's best sellers since the 1930s, with over 600 million copies have been sold. Some of her most famous series are indicated on these stamps, including the Naughty series, which she wrote over 24 books for, the Mallory Towers series set in a all-girls school, and the Famous Five books. She wrote over 20 books for the Famous Five, were a group of children who unmasked villains and solved crimes. Tova Jansson was born in Helsinki, Finland, although at the time it was part of Russia. Her mother was a postage stamp designer and who designed several of the early Finland stamps in the 1930s and 40s. At the age 14, Tova wrote and illustrated her first picture book. She went on to continue illustrating. She worked for she worked for a satirical magazine called Garm, which was anti-fascist. And in 1945, she created the Movements. She wrote the first of 9 prose books featuring these creatures that went on to become the stars of picture books, and then comic strips, and then eventually films and plays. In 1966, she won the Hans Christian Andersen Award, which is the highest honor available to authors and illustrators of children's literature. Alf Preussen was born in Rudskoga, Norway, which is located near Lillehammer, north of Oslo. He started studying as a copywriter and an actor, and he became enormously famous in his own country, extremely popular in the 1950s and 60s. He started out in writing songs and singing, and he would tell stories and plays on the radio, including children's stories. Starting in 1956, he wrote his first book, featuring a character that, translated into English, has been known as Mrs. Pepperpot. And this is usually because she shrinks to the size of a pepper pot in several of her stories. He wrote over 60 of these stories that were published in 8 books. Ian Falconer was born in Ridgefield, Connecticut, and he was very active in theater design. He's done some opera works and costumes and sets for operas and plays. He illustrated 30 covers for the New Yorker magazine, but what he's most famous for are the writing and illustrating the Olivia books. So since 2000, he's so far written 13 books of this cute and adorable pig. She is good at lots of things. Maurice Sendak was born in Brooklyn, New York, and at age 12, he decided to become an illustrator after watching the Disney film Fantasia. One of his first commissions was to create window displays for the toy store FAO Schwartz in New York, and his illustrations were first published in 1947. He spent most of the 50s illustrating children's books that were written by others, but he reached international acclaim for writing and illustrating the book Where the Wild Things Are in 1963. He went on to write other books, write and illustrate other books like In the Night Kitchen or Outside Over There or 7 Little Monsters. And in 1970, he also won a Hans Christian Andersen Award for illustrating. Lee Hobbs was born in Williamstown, Victoria, Australia, and he worked as an artist at some of the Australia's amusement parks. He did some design work for some of their, exhibits and whatnot. But he's since 1994, he's been writing over 20 books for children and illustrating for children that feature characters like Old Tom, a one-eyed cat, Horrible Harriet, Fiona the Pig, Mr. Chicken, and Mr. Badger. Edward Lear was born in North London. He was raised by his older sister and started drawing by age 16. He became one of the greatest ornithological artists of his era. He was working for the Zoological Society in London, drawing birds. He's one of the first artists to draw birds from live birds, as opposed to using either stuffed or from their skins. And his eyesight deteriorated, so he turned instead to landscape painting and travel. But in 1846, he published a book of nonsense. He's most known for his nonsense literature, which is basically limericks and using bombastic or strange words and whatnot. For example, a stuffed rhinoceros he might call a diaphanous door scraper. But in 1871, he published another book called Nonsense, Songs, Stories, Botany, and Alphabets. And this book contained his most famous his most famous creation, The Owl and the Pussycat.
Mm.
Someone who illustrated a version of The Owl and the Pussycat was Erica Rutherford. Erica was born Eric Rutherford in Edinburgh, Scotland. She attended the Dartmouth Royal Naval College and worked as a cadet before she studied dramatic art at the Royal Academy of Arts in London. She worked as an actor and studied theater design and costume design and painting. She went on to direct a film in South Africa and eventually moved to the United States, where she taught painting in Louisville and West Virginia and Missouri. In 1976, she had reassignment surgery and settled in Prince Edward Island, Canada, and this stamp features one of her paintings. She went on to she started illustrating children's books, including an alphabet book that's called An Island Alphabet. An Island Alphabet. Someone else who wrote an alphabet book for children was Langston Hughes. His alphabet book was called The Sweet and Sour Animal Book. And I noticed that on this cachet, on the left-hand side, it mentions the book. He was born in Joplin, Missouri, and grew up in several cities of the Midwest, including Lawrence, Lincoln, and Cleveland, Ohio. He first came to national attention through publishing poetry written explicitly for children in some of the publications, and he wrote other books in addition to all his adult writing. He also wrote books for children, such as the First Book of Jazz, the First Book of the West Indies, and the First Book of Africa. Catherine Lee Bates was born in Falmouth, Massachusetts. She graduated from Wellesley College and started teaching in high schools. In 1889, she was responsible for popularizing the concept of Mrs. Claus. She wrote a poem called Goody Santa Claus on a Sleigh Ride that featured Mrs. Claus, and it was included in her book of verses for children called Sunshine and Other Verses for Children. That same year, she wrote a young adult novel called Rose and Thorn that won a prize that allowed her to study at Oxford. And when she returned to the United States, she became a professor at Wellesley University. These days, she's mostly remembered for writing the lyrics to America the Beautiful. Robert Louis Stevenson was born in Edinburgh, Scotland. He was a sickly and thin only child, and his health fared better in warmer climates. His father was a lighthouse engineer, so he enjoyed traveling with him to inspect lighthouses around the Great Britain. And he married a woman with a stepson named Lloyd, and they settled in southern England in Bournemouth. And there is where he wrote his young adult novels like Treasure Island and Kidnapped, as well as a book of child's verses called The Child's Garden of Verses. Eventually, they went to the United States, and he sailed the Pacific for about 3 years before settling in Samoa, where he died. Horatio Alger was born in Chelsea, Massachusetts. He grew up in a privileged social environment. He studied at Harvard and graduated from Harvard Divinity School. And he started to support himself by writing moralistic fiction. He moved to New York and he started writing books for boys. They were meant to be to present models of behavior for the abandoned boys that he saw on the streets. His biggest success was Ragged Dick, and he wrote more than 100 of these books, and they became enormously popular up until about the 1920s, when their popularity waned. Mary Wollstonecraft was born in Spitalfields, London. She worked as a ladies' companion and set up a school with her sisters, and also worked as a governess. She's most famous, and her most influential work was A Vindication of the Rights of Women. She was a very strong supporter of women's rights, and she wrote one book for children that continued to advocate education for women. Because at the time, in her era, it wasn't very common for people to educate girls. It was called Original Stories from Real Life, and featured a series of didactic tales. Selma Lagerlöf was born in Värmland in western Sweden. She had a deep love for reading, and she also became a teacher, like many of the authors listed here. She told stories, and she wrote her first novel in 1891. She won the Nobel Prize in Literature in 1909. She was the first woman to receive that gift. In 1902, the National Teachers Association asked her to write a geography book for children. So she wrote The Wonderful Adventures of Niles, which featured a boy who was shrunk to a small size so that he could ride on the back of a goose all over Sweden. And she mixed in historical and geographical facts about the provinces of Sweden into the novel. And it's one of her more popular works, and was translated into 30 languages. Anne Frank was born in Frankfurt, Germany. In 1933, her family moved to Amsterdam. And in 1942, her father gave her an autographed book that she promptly started to use as a diary. And the story is that in July 1942, the family went into hiding in a building in Amsterdam, and a couple years later, they were arrested, and she eventually was sent to Auschwitz and then Bergen-Belsen, where she died. But after the war in 1947, her diary was published in the Netherlands, and in 1952, it was published here in the United States as The Diary of a Young Girl. And lastly, Sally Ride was born in Los Angeles, California. She was a nationally ranked tennis player. She studied physics at Stanford University, and in 1978 was selected by NASA as part of the first class to select women for training to be an astronaut. In 1983, she became the first American woman in space, and that her first flight together with a second flight in space, she spent 343 hours in space. Afterwards, she became a professor at UC San Diego and the director of the California Space Institute. But starting in 2001, she created Sally Ride Science, which wrote or co-authored with her partner Tam O'Shaughnessy 7 books for children. These are 9 nonfiction books that basically dealt with topics like the solar system and Mars and Earth. And I found this cover, which has in its cachet image in the background pictures of the works that she created for children. Thank you. Are there any questions?
Excellent.
Really nice presentation. Very thorough.
Very nice. Very nice.
Well researched, that's for sure.
I did not realize there were so many LGBT authors of children's books.
Yeah, it's pretty amazing.
That is incredible.
Thank you.
You could, since if you own all the material, we'd be thrilled to have an exhibit.
That could make a nice one frame.
Yeah, I had thought about that, but I wanted to start with a presentation at least. It's something I might do in the future, yes.
Near future. You have till 2022.
Thank you, John. That was a great presentation. And besides AIDS on stamps, I collect stamps on stamps. And I saw the Maria Walsh picture that you had. There's a stamp on stamp that I don't have, never seen. And that is something I'm going to be looking for. Again, thank you for a great presentation. I always learn something from these presentations. Thank you, John.
I was surprised that Oscar Wilde did children's books. I was really shocked at that.
Yeah, it sounds like there's a journal article there somewhere too.
Yeah.
For Enid Blyton, I was not familiar with at all, but I liked the gnomes. We saw the pictures of the gnomes on stamps. I'm going to have to look that author up. There was also a notable trend in theater, or theater prior to making children's books.
My kids love the Moomin series, Tove Jansson. I found them quite by accident, and my daughter could not get enough.
They're so cute.
Great.
On the Anne Frank stamp, you said that there was a plate flaw in one of the stamps, and looking at it, what was the plate flaw?
The second letter N has there's like a little tail on the second letter N of the word Netherlands.
Ah, okay.
Hmm.
So it's small.
Yeah, let me think yeah. Here, let me see if I can.
Well, oh, I see it.
There's
Yeah.
Yeah.
this,
Uh-huh.
yeah. It might be slightly obscured by the cancellation, but I tried to blow up the stamp from the cover and then put a non-plate ball stamp below it. So
Huh.
just
Yeah.
a printing on one of the ends.
Yep. Now we can see the little tail.
Oh,
Well, thank you very much. And thank you
Oh,
all
you're
for
welcome.
coming. Is there any other questions for John? We
I
had,
like that Sally Ride cover. I never saw that one before, so that was nice.
Yeah.
now, so I'm going to end the recording now.